the present day, which means they can never build up self-sufficient institutions, never be stable, never achieve the kind of things which all teams probably want in this debate. I'm going to talk about two things. First of all, why this massively disempowers the leaders and why this is so critical and so important. And then second of all, why this legitimizes the occupiers to stay such that we can't get rid of them. And then second of all, talking about even if they don't stay, how you never develop stability because you never get it self-sufficiently, and it leads to more tensions in the region, and why this is all so much worse. First of all, a couple of clarifications. This is just that by not assisting does not equal active resistance. In some circumstances, we'd support active resistance, but it's OG's capacity, like an opening government, we think it's the national leader's capacity to decide whether to resist or whether to just be neutral and not really take a stance, and based on what's strategically optimal. I think that's important to clarify. The second thing I just want to clarify in framing is that there are many mechanisms as to why the occupying nation won't backlash or respond aggressively, such as international scrutiny, media scrutiny. I think critically, the occupying nations always go in on a domestic political mandate for liberation and freedom, not just to screw people over and kill them and harm them and bring much more oppression. Because this is their mandate, I think this is the strong incentive that they have, not to be seen to be incredibly bad against like the regime who are standing against them. I know these incentives are symmetric on both sides for why they don't do these things so terribly, but I do think it mitigates the worst excesses of any response to like not having cooperation, which I think are massively important because they want transparency, they want to look politically good, so scrutiny harms them in important ways. First, let's stop there and talk about how this disempowers leaders and why this is so bad. Because I think if you side with the occupier, you lose all domestic political legitimacy. First of all, maybe they don't like the occupiers. That's probably context dependent. We don't win in all cases. But second of all, because it demonstrates the leaders lack the capacity to provide the leadership and like stability, which they don't have the capacity to do. So they depend on being occupied. The problem is then you lose any buy-in and credibility because people become receptive to the occupiers' incentives rather than your own incentives. Given the occupiers want to help stability on either side, it's a much bigger change that you're able to then decrease buy-in and everyone becomes more receptive to their incentives. Because note, the incentives of the occupier are want to be seen to be good, not necessarily doing good. So they don't care about long-term stability in the sense of institutions being rigorous enough to be able to respond to people and take best of people. They want to emphasize their role in increasing stability, right? Which is why they want to impose their own structures and institutions and have it as high visibility of their role, because that's where they get their like creds from, by being like, oh, we're so wonderful, rather than saying it happens authentically. So I think disempowering leaders and making them much more receptive to the interests and the incentives of stability in the way that the occupiers want to do is incredibly harmful. I think that so you then have less discursive like influence with the occupier because you become an unnecessary part, like you've assisted them, so your voice isn't that necessary. I think then this means that only the most elite leaders have say, and the grassroots ones don't have any influence over what happens. Because when you assist them, their voice goes unheard. I think the comparative is that it is genuinely a powerful leverage over whether to resist them or not, because you don't make that much difference in them helping, given they have so much capacity. But you do make a massive difference to getting much more backlash against them. Note, I think domestic leaders are always the most likely to galvanize local buy-in because people just trust them more because they understand the environment, they understand what the problems are, and hence they're more likely to have the swing in whether you agree with the occupier or not. So they have much more capacity on our side. But secondly, and more fundamentally, what this does is legitimize the occupiers such that they just never leave. I think that's what happens in Iraq because you give them all the tools and the credibility, and critically, you tie your success as a national leader to the success of the occupier and doing their things. Success of the occupier, which means it's very hard to go against them or to get buy-in to go against them at the point where you tied your political success to theirs, and hence you don't want to critique. The thing is, this is all contingent on being bad occupiers, and I just think there are so many reasons why this is true. Like knowledge and lay of the land means that you're just less capable of getting stability, right? And if you're less receptive to national leaders, that's incredibly harmful. So, for example, in Iraq, it was the US being insensitive to the Sunni-Shia split in certain regions, which then exacerbated conflict. In Afghanistan, it was treating the Pashtuns as homogenous and exacerbating conflict instead of recognizing the differences between different groups. That is about capacity. I think the more fundamental one is also about incentives, like countries occupy for oil, to win elections, to delegitimize their foreign policy rivals, and then co-opt conflicts as an effective proxy war. I think because these are bad incentives and capacity, legitimizing them and allowing them the political tools to then stay in these countries because you've given all control over the institutions, because you've given them all control of the institutions because you've legitimized them being there, is massively harmful. The implication is that I think they're not likely to leave and they're likely to stay, which is incredibly harmful. But my next point is going to be even if they do not stay and if they leave, why this is still much worse for stability. A couple of things. First of all, as we've clarified, political incentives of the occupiers are always self-aggrandization for political gain, which means they want visibility to be at the forefront, which means they're likely to put their own institutions, not local ones. The problem is, this is incredibly politically unstable because if something political happens in the US and there's a massive backlash against the things that they're doing, they can't then ensure that that stays and ensure that continues. This is harmful because there are different pathways to withdraw, and all of them are bad. First of all, you might want to withdraw, but want to keep the country dependent on you for like economic and political power. Because you've had so much stake in that country, you have a massive capacity to keep them dependent, which means they don't develop self-sufficient institutions that can ensure long-term stability. You're always just dependent on that rival. But second of all, even if something goes bad and the country turns incredibly toxic, you want nothing to do with them anymore, so you just withdraw instantly, and then don't because withdraw instantly because your political domestic incentives are much more important to these regimes than what's actually happening in that country, given there's a massive visibility gap between what they're doing and what the voters see they're doing, the government see they're doing. I think the example of this is colonialism. Like the British left India abruptly, which led to mass migration problems, ethnic cleansing, but critically the requisite institutions to deal with these problems weren't set up, because as soon as the British withdraw, there had never been that natural development and self-sufficiency in the institutions in these countries, which means you just literally set them up to fail and don't develop these capacities at the point where you buy international, let the occupiers do it, which is why the comparative is investing in domestic institutions and making sure you have control over how it happens, so that it's going to happen in a way which is sustainable. Theo, I'd love to engage with your POI.
Okay, but isn't this grossly comparative? Because they might hate their own government for cooperating, but they're going to hate the opposing government even more. And if they pull out, then you literally don't have any government infrastructure left.
Yeah, so I think the point is like you have more capacity to get domestic buy-in when you have better incentives than the occupier does to be able to make sure that you're doing in a way which is sensitive to the lay of the land and has their best interests at heart. But you have more capacity to do if you're a leader who understands how things work, as opposed to an occupier who has a very superficial conception and also bad incentives of what they want. I think this is important, but I think the last thing is, so this is why you don't get long-term sustainability, which is the most important thing, given even if we absorb harm in the short term, developing institutions long-term is more important because there's just more benefit to get from them being rigorous. But I think the second thing to do with stability is regional stability, because if you cozy up with a big boy power, odds are that creates so much distrust around people with you in the region, because they see you as someone who's willing to side when you get investment from foreign powers who they're likely being alienated against, because conflict tends to spill over, right? So this makes you much more of this makes you much more politically vulnerable to the regional volatility, seeing that you've made this ally which is likely to be politically unpopular. I think the comparative that escapes these problems is being able to make sure that you invest in your own institutions and make sure that you're doing things which are strategically correct for you, not being manipulated by a foreign power to solve their domestic political problems or agenda. Ultimately, the right to sovereignty is critical. Doing this is important for self-determination, but more critically, because it's important for stability, important for the well-being of the country and the building of institutions, I'm very proud to be on government.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I'm happy to call upon the Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible? Yep, lovely. Just give me 1 second with my timer and my papers, and then I will signal and begin. Am I still audible? I just got my timer up, just making sure before I begin. Yeah, that's great. I'll be starting in 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. OG is already out of this debate because they aren't extremely comparative, to the extent that they never show why, in particular, if we don't cooperate with these individuals, these things that they talk about political legitimacy or withdrawing would change. I think they're already out. I'll be doing 3 broad things in the speech. A, why in particular leaders are important in cooperation and what benefits to stability that they bring. Secondly, talking about why this incentivizes the occupying forces to actually leave earlier, co-opting all the benefits that OG talk about that they don't get on that side of the house. Lastly, I'll do with some extraneous rebuttal. Firstly, why are leaders incredibly effective in doing this? And I think OG kind of smartly sets this up, because I think OG needs to defend a comparative where there is only occupation by foreign forces and either these leaders, A, do not do anything as they themselves say, or B, are actively resistant. I think, first of all, this flippant stance in terms of what leaders actually do is hurts them quite a lot, right? Because to the extent that the leaders that they talk about don't do anything, I'm quite unclear as to how they gain the domestic political legitimacy that they hang their benefits on. But more importantly, right, I think that OG themselves mechanize why, in particular, local leaders of so important to stability for all the reasons they give for why international forces alone are not good. Things like lack of knowledge, they say, lack of layout of the land, things like lack of appreciation for ethnic things and history of these places that might cause conflict. I think that in particular on their side, they have to defend a world where the occupation is poorly run exactly because of these things. On our side, the cooperation means that you're far more able going to mitigate these things. How is that true? Not only, I think, broadly do leaders have all these types of knowledges and things like that allow for a better occupation, they also have extremely high amounts of existing channels of governance. Things like using your police force to snuff out and stop domestic guerrilla attacks and confiscate weapons. Things like knowledge of the terrain as they talk about, which is broadly important. But secondly, these leaders themselves also have cults of personality and the ability to use information channels like the media, like other things, to ensure that that domestic populace is stable. But thirdly, and this is super important, I think that to the extent that these leaders cooperate with these Western institutions, they importantly would ensure that they importantly would ensure that the resources of the state would be used to maintaining stability. Now, all kind of tries to preempt this both ways by saying, when you intervene, you probably won't do that many bad things, and then they contradict themselves by saying, but states only care about looking good, but not doing good. But I think the main sources of stability here are not necessarily from atrocities themselves, but the broader sources from things like having the capacity and personnel and people to do basic things like distribute food, like ensure that people on the ground get to live their life properly, ensure things like infrastructure rebuilding and stuff like that. To the extent that OG concede that this is important, I posit that cooperating with the state that's occupying and using that state's resources and things like that and economies of scale to facilitate your infrastructure building is far, far more better. To the extent that you get the expertise of these people, just look at how Afghanistan's security forces improved so much after the US troops have trained them and stuff like that. To the extent you're able to leverage off their resources, I think that this is good. But what is the harm on that side? Because to the extent that you don't cooperate, there are extreme harms. I think the first harm is even if you aren't actively resisting, people find you as intrusive to the operations of the occupying state, and therefore it's extremely easy for escalation of tensions and hostilities. You already see this in the recountings of how non-cooperative occupations happen when people think, for instance, like the domestic soldiers are always in the way, they're not really helping us. It's very easy to have escalation of hostilities and harm done on the ground. But secondly, and this is very crucial, to the extent that you're unable to cooperate with these states, with the occupying power, it means that in particular, the occupying power, once instability occurs, will use their own insensitive means to crack down on that instability. This looks like, for instance, how under the Japanese occupation in Hong Kong, extremely draconian laws were attributed that literally abused anyone that was on the street. Extreme curfews and crackdowns that halted all economic activity. To the extent that they don't have a better and more palatable outlet of the state as the alternative, it's far more likely the occupying powers to do extremely, extremely bad things. On our side, we're able to utilize the state's muscle and resources and provide basic stability in a much more effective fashion. Why is this important? Because I think stability is a very important precondition for two important reasons. First, stability is the precondition to all other pursuits and enjoyments of life. That is to say, if you're unable to live, you're unable to eat, you're unable to function properly, all other higher rights that the other type might talk about are not important to the extent you can't access basic living. But secondly, individual preferences are adjusted and aggregated based on social circumstances. And broadly, after the occupation, after a war, people largely prefer stability because it gets their lives back to normal and gets them going. That's why leaders are uniquely mechanically important in ensuring stability and patching out the exact harms that opening government concede will happen. Why are things far worse off on their side, and why would we get withdrawal? I think opening government are kind of contradictory in the sense that they themselves concede that there would be some inherent incentive to withdraw. Things like the resources used in occupation that are inherently unstable, that take away from other more pressing vulture stuff like healthcare, things like Ebola back effects, things like media, ensuring that countries would actually want to withdraw. I think it's key that withdrawal is, as they say, is portrayed in a palatable and good fashion. But the issue on that side of the house is to the extent that they can't ensure stability for all the reasons that Chiara gives, it becomes extremely hard to withdraw, and these inherent incentives do not kick in because there's always an excuse by the occupying power to stay because they don't think that these places are stable. They can always say we have to stay to ensure the safety of our troops. They can weaponize things like nationalism, like patriotism, to ensure that withdrawal doesn't happen. That's exactly why, without cooperation, the occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan have been so much more longer, because the inability for these governments to work together means cracking down on stuff like the Taliban would be far worse. On our side, we allow for far better incentives to withdraw because we allow for the sharing of power, which makes governments far more effective. But also, I think broadly, there are broad incentives to let this cooperation be a mutual one and not a stacked one in terms of power asymmetry. The reason for this is because of the expertise of these things mean that in particular, the expertise of these local governments mean that in particular they're well suited to lots of different things that I think occupying power are less well suited, and therefore they have an incentive to see some degree of power of them to ensure that they're able to effectively implement stability. Before I go on, I would say closing government if possible. If not, then OG.
Logically extending your case, should people in the poor world tolerate repressive dictatorships because they ensure stability?
That depends on whether or not there's a comparative. I think to the extent if you ask the poor person on the ground, if they have no other option, tolerance is better than them sacrificing themselves. And I think we've shown why comparatively we get better stability. But lastly, on the idea of how this also creates power vacuums, that's extremely bad. The inability for these states to control things on the ground necessarily creates pockets of unoccupied territory or unmanned places whereby power vacuums occur. That's exactly why ISIS occurred in places where there was no cooperation between the host state and the intervening state, because of the fact that the intervening state lacked the ability to crack down on these things. Things like terrorism, things like extremism are extremely rampant within these areas when you're unable to cooperate with the host state and use things to ensure stability. There's a huge harm they have to bite. This harm is also important because it takes down the last point that they have on regional volatility. To the extent, and they never mechanize this, right? Never tell me why cooperating with an occupying power necessarily alienates you from people around your region, nor why these people are particularly important in the context of the debate. But I think the key is here. To the extent that your nation is less stable on their side, this by far alienates your relationships because people find you unsafe. It's impossible to do economic trade. It's impossible to integrate with your nation. To the extent we provide better stability, states that are self-interested in the economy would broadly have incentive to integrate. Anyways, I think we win that as well. Because OG themselves show you why sole occupation is inefficient. I think we take this debate. Proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I'm happy to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the debate. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me? Before I start, this debate almost forces us to make some generalizations about all occupied countries. So if I hurt anyone's sensibilities, I preemptively apologize. All of their case hangs on one mechanism, the US being self-aware. Think about it. We said domestic leaders have a lay of the land. They understand domestic ethnic cleavages. They understand domestic social and economic cleavages. They said these are reasons why the US government and other occupiers will take help from these people. Sure, I'd like to think the US government hasn't been that self-aware over the past century or so. The travesty of occupation that we try to prove to you is that these people have information that is critical for the integration and successful advancement of these countries, but they are consistently and continuously ignored and treated as second-class citizens within their own country. Before I deal with anything that opening opposition said, I want to advance one further extension. This isn't contingent on anything that's happened in the round as of yet. The fact that you resist occupation in the now means that occupiers are much more likely to occupy with impunity in the future, which is to say that if they had resisted in 2003 in Iraq and they had resisted in 2001 in Afghanistan, future occupiers, such as the Russian occupiers of Crimea and of Georgia, in other cases would have been much less likely to occupy with impunity and without very good reason, because they know that they will face domestic resistance. This is a crucial extension about responsible occupation that stands independent of anything that's happened in opening half as of yet. The first question that I deal with within my speech is, why is resistance or any form of response successful? I want to note that their debate is happening in a vacuum. There is an occupier and they are the occupied. It's unclear to me why, if you resist US intervention, Russia and China do not help you because they also exist on planet Earth. It is unclear to me that if you're not getting aid from the United States of America, why the fucking World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières don't step in and provide you the aid that you need in order to bolster your institutions. The implication of this is that this debate doesn't operate in a vacuum where you only have one power to cooperate with. Often cooperating with this power comes at the expense of cooperating with all other powers, insofar as they silo you to create a culture of dependency. But B, perceptually speaking, is much less likely to get allegiance from any other power, the point at which you have this sort of problem. But the second thing I say about resistance, which I think is equally important, is that the cult of personality stuff that they were saying is actually an argument on our side. These domestic leaders do have a cult of personality, that's precisely why resistance will be successful instead of be unsuccessful. So that's symmetric on both sides. But I go further and tell you that it actually gets worse on their side, because if you have a distaste for the occupier, then you are likely to oppose this person despite their cult of personality. But secondly, your cult of personality is abolished because you are no longer the invincible leader who will shepherd this community towards better times. You are a hack who is dependent on foreign occupiers to make sure that your people have services. These points prove that resistance is likely to be successful and likely to lead to, at least in the short term, better outcomes. Let's talk about the second one, which is about long-term capacity. I think this is really important. The first thing that we have to point out here is that if you are resisting a foreign occupier, then you need to provide your people some sort of alternative agenda, right? You can't just be like, fuck the US, but I don't know what we're doing. That's realistically not going to be the political response. You have to frame, instead of what they are doing, we are going to do X. Instead of them opening schools and hospitals, we are doing Y. This creates the incentive inherently within these people to then create an alternative agenda to create institutions. That's very important to point out. But what about capacity in the long term? It's so interesting that they mentioned the Afghan example, because yes, the ASF, the Afghan security forces, are indeed being trained by US military. What happened in 2014 when Obama pulled half of his forces out? More attacks within a week by the Taliban than the entire fucking year previous, because they know that the moment the big boys, so-called, step out, this country is inherently vulnerable towards the same problems that they had before the United States of America went in the first place. This proves to you that the only way that you get incentive and capacity is on our side by making sure that you have alternatives, making sure you have domestic political incentives, but crucially a pathway towards change, which can only come from having our sort of resistance. The final thing I just want to point out, panel, is because there's an intuition on this side that, like, occupation is terrible and these people are going to suffer. I agree. You know what? Being in Syria is fucking horrible. Being in Iraq is fucking horrible. I've fucking been there. But that's not the point. It takes decades to set up institutions, and we're fine with taking that bullet. That's realistically what happens in post-conflict societies. We don't have to defend at the point at which we resist any occupier. There's a silver bullet of some sort, and then we start getting pristine hospitals and schools. Realistically, it's going to take time. Our point was that we are likely to trade short-term problems, which we're equally happy trading with, for long-term incentives and capacities to create infrastructure which outlast the occupier. Before I deal with how the occupier leaves, because I do feel respectfully this was misconstrued by opening opposition, I'm very happy to take closing opposition's engagement. Please. Nothing. Please, opening opposition. Go on.
To the extent that your argument is that you trade off these short-term things, how are you actually able to create the long-term institutions and have the resources to do that and stuff without cooperation, given that short-term stability is a prerequisite for creating all of that?
That's literally not true. I don't even need to know what to say that. Like, it's true. You can create long-term institutions while you have instability. For instance, all post-colonial states ever. So I don't know where you were going with that. But secondly, all of the reasons I gave, you have foreign policy alternatives. You can go towards other powers. You can go towards humanitarian aid. You have domestic political incentives to work on these things, etc., etc. I will add one additional thing here, that the government, the foreign occupier, often has an incentive to take out the most economically, strategically important people for your side to disempower you. Because if you have lots of brilliant doctors and teachers on your side, you don't need to listen to the occupier. The occupier needs to disempower you to get you to listen to them, which is exactly what happened in the Ba'athist regime, by the way, in Iraq. They took out the teachers, made them unemployed. They took out the soldiers, made them unemployed. And when these people went back as farmers to their estates, all they had an option was to pick up a gun and join guerrilla groups, which eventually became ISIS. The occupying force has an inherent incentive to disempower the best of you, to leave the weakest of you so that they can dominate you. Finally, how do these occupiers leave? A, they leave in a way that leaves you chronically dependent because they have inherent economic and geopolitical interests in the region. They might want to make you a geopolitical ally, a geopolitical pawn in a great game. Or secondly, they might just want oil from your country. Meaning this is horrible because this leaves you chronically dependent. But the second scenario is arguably worse. They leave and cut the umbilical cord abruptly because they lost the election in their country, or because there isn't enough buying anymore, because too many of our boys are dying. These are terrible reasons to leave, because this abruption means mass atrocities for their side. I've shown to you that the only sustainable path towards development is a painful one, but it's the only correct one. I'm very, very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and am happy to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the debate. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible? Yeah, I would just like to repeat the same thing as the DPM. I'm sorry if I make any generalizations in this debate. It doesn't really represent my true views of this matter. Okay, so I will be starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, the long-term pathway to development. Second, dealing with this idea of withdrawal. And lastly, dealing with this idea of domestic political legitimacy. Before that, I just want to deal with Hamza's extension that came out in the first 2 minutes of his speech, because he tells us that we need like a deterrent effect to ensure that future governments in the West or China are less likely to occupy you in the future. I want to note that there is a tension, right? Because if Kiara sets up her model to be so soft, where she says not resisting doesn't mean you're actively stirring up unrest and you're not actively stirring up conflict, then I'm unsure as to why this deterrent effect is going to be incredibly huge anyways. So purely based on their own model, I don't think they can get the solvency of deterrence, which was a very high bar that Hamza established. So let's firstly deal with this idea about the long-term path to development. What do we hear? The first thing we heard is this idea that there is no long-term path to development, and therefore there's always going to be instability. I want to deal with 2 things in this speech. Firstly, I want to prove to you why is it that there are natural organic incentives to always withdraw, and therefore the sort of occupation that Gav talks about is at best a short-term thing. We give you several reasons as to why there's organic incentives to withdraw. So for instance, if the debate is really about US-Afghan interventions, we told you in Josh that interventions are often financially costly, and there's always things like a body bag effect in terms of your own soldiers dying on the ground, which means that there's domestic political pressure in the US to always withdraw troops from Afghanistan anyway. This means that at best, occupation is only in the short term. But what did we tell you in Josh that was the unique delta of the round, right? To the extent that there are organic incentives to withdraw anyway, on their side of the house, they increase the political capital and legitimacy to remain in those areas. Because at the point to which there's constant instability on the ground, at the point to which there's constant tensions and fighting, you increase the political capital and you increase the legitimacy of foreign governments to say to their people that there is a reason why we have to remain in those areas. Hamza tells us, but it's problematic because when you withdraw, it's going to be very unstable because there is no development of institutions. I just want to note that this is untrue for 3 reasons. Firstly, what we tell you in opening opposition is that at the point to which you work with the occupying powers, this has 2 main benefits. The first is you just gain a lot more experience learning about systems of governance or learning how to deal with terrorism on the ground, which means that you have far greater capacity to govern in the long term at the point to which US pulls out. But second, I think this idea about creation of institutions is a point on our side of the house for 2 reasons. Firstly, because oftentimes you require short-term stability for you to be able to create institutions. Why? You require short-term stability for people to even buy into concepts like courts, the rule of law, or even elections. But most importantly, you often need to work with the Western governments to be able to create institutions like courts and parliaments, because all of these things often require a degree of Western expertise. The only response we heard from Hamza was, but you can work with your other regional governments, right? But the problem is, and I think this is regrettable, the unfortunate reality is in places like Iraq and Afghan, you really can't rely on your regional neighbors because a lot of your regional neighbors are also facing a lot of problems in their own homeland in terms of things like terrorism, so on and so forth. What is the upshot of this analysis? The upshot of this analysis is, number 1, we've shown you that occupation is at best a short-term construct. But number 2, we told you that to the extent that occupation is a short-term construct, we give incentives, or rather, we provide a long-term pathway to stability at the point to which you work with these types of leaders, you work with the Western leaders, and most importantly, you convince the US government that you are capable of governing, which means that they have far greater capacity and far greater incentive to pull up. We think that the example of Afghanistan is on our side of the house, because we think that for the longest time, the Afghan government's refusal to continuously work with the US government was what resulted in the Afghan government's incredible weakness, which meant that oftentimes there was a lot of uncertainty over whether US will want to pull up. We think on our side of the house in a counterfactual where the Afghan government openly embraced the US government, openly worked with them, openly learned from them, openly created institutions together with them, we thought that counterfactual was so much better. That is why in terms of the long-term pathway to development, we thought we won. Let's then talk about domestic political legitimacy, because the argument we hear from opening government is this idea that at the point to which you do not resist, you end up losing your domestic political legitimacy. I have 2 responses. Firstly, I think it's uncomparative, because I think the counterfactual in this debate is that intervention is going to happen either ways, and we are incredibly sorry for that, because I think like things like intervention happens in a spur of the moment. We regret the Afghan intervention, we regret the Iraq intervention. But to the extent that interventions happen either ways, the question is, what should you do? We think that even if you rise up, the problem is you will never have enough capacity and resources to be able to fight against the US government, which means that at a point to which you fail, which is very likely, you lose legitimacy on your side of the house. But second, Josh tells you that far more plausible counterfactual in a world in which you eventually win is because of your lack of expertise and your lack of resources, because you cannot tap on the sort of like resources that Western governments have. This means that it's far more likely to have things like terrorist attacks and instability on the ground, all of which also reduces your domestic political legitimacy in the long run. The last thing they tell us is, but you can have things like regional political stability. But I think it's unclear to me as to why a lot of these governments who want to work with you expend expensive resources to engage in things like counterterrorism fighting, because a lot of these things are incredibly expensive. That is to say, I think like Iraqi neighbors like Yemen, for instance, or Lebanon, have no incentive and no capacity to be able to engage in these types of counterterrorism efforts, which often take a huge degree of resources, as Josh tells you. But the last thing we talked about in this debate was, why is it that we are happy to fetishize stability, even if it means some degree of trade-offs and some degree of like lesser human happiness on our side of the house? We told you that local leaders are particularly important in maintaining stability for various reasons, like their geographical knowledge on the ground and their ability to communicate with people, to calm them down and to preserve peace. We thought this was incredibly important for two reasons. Number one, because we thought that reducing tensions literally allows you to save lives, but reducing tensions also allows you to have far more resources to allocate to things like healthcare and welfare instead of always fighting on the ground. Before I move on, any POIs from closing government?
There is no single occupying force in this world that will allow leaders to have leeway in governing the states. They are likely to control them and not allow them to do the things that you want to plan in this debate.
No, because like what we tell you is that to the extent that there's domestic political pressure in places like USA to eventually pull out, we argue that there is a natural incentive to allow for some sort of leadership transition, to slowly allow for a ceding of power, because eventually countries like US always want to pull out because there is like a lot of like domestic political pressure, things like body bag effect and the financial cost of interventions. That is to say, we think the nuance on our side of the house is that because in the long run there are incentives to pull out, and I think to an extent Hamza agrees with this, what we argue as a nuance is that there is some level of incentive to slowly cede power to local governments, which becomes far less likely at the point to which you're openly antagonistic towards the Western governments, because these Western governments no longer trust you. Why is it that we thought that like reducing suffering and maximizing utility was the most important? Because we think even if CG comes up to tell us something about individual autonomy, we think individuals adjust their preferences to the social circumstances they're put in all the time. So in World War II, I would have preferenced peace. But in 2020, I would prefer to break at euros. That is to say, I'm not sure why individual autonomy cannot be something that is malleable. For all those reasons, happy to stand in opening opposition.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech and indeed the entire top half of the debate, and I'm happy to call upon the member of government to extend the debate. Hear, hear.
Hello, can you hear me? Can I just have a couple of seconds? My partner went to the bathroom, he'll be back soon, if it's possible, thanks. Okay, 3, 2, 1. I have been waiting 7 rounds in order to get to the top room of Euros, and I intend to win it in today's debate, Mr. Speaker. 3 things in extension. Firstly, why always the occupying force has structural reasons to be aggressive and plundering the population it occupies. Secondly, 5 responses to opening government as to why they do not have any incentive to give power to the leaders, and why over time the leaders on their side of the house will become more focused to the regime instead of against. Thirdly, the principle why we believe that the leaders should never operate with occupying forces in of itself of irrespective of practical outcomes. Firstly, notice there are 4 structural reasons why occupying force is always going to be problematic. First of all, because they have an incentive to plunder, literally steal the resources of the population there, not give money to the people there. Why? Because they want to have the biggest bang on their buck, because usually wars are expensive and they have an incentive to meet this. But secondly, they have an incentive to always create fear into these places, to harass the individuals there, to limit rights in order to slow down uprising, in order to never spread the seeds of an uprising happening to them. Thirdly, they have an incentive to stop technology and communication. Why? Because you simply want the rest of the world to not know what exactly you've been doing there, how you've been doing. So there, for example, cut supply lines, limit the internet, limit television, limit communication there, limit phone minute, all of these things. Fourthly, because, look, this is a retrospective debate in a sense, because war has already happened, they already have committed many problems there. So there are already stories about rape, genocide, people killing, etc. So they have an incentive to keep the population down and to limit any form of occurrences that may happen to them. They always have an incentive to do all these things, but all contest and say, but it's better for the leaders to be with them instead of for that. 5 reasons why this is the case. Firstly, we believe that that occupational forces have an incentive to limit the powers, the powers of the people who are ruling there. Why? Because they want to limit the capability of these people uprising or bettering the situation there, for all the reasons we give to you. So they're firstly likely to limit the information that the leader has, but also secondly would want them to routinely report to them, explaining what exactly they have been doing, who with them communicating, etc. Meaning that leader has limited leeway on what to do. Secondly, the occupational force is likely to change the levers of power that the leader has. So for example, change the ministers that the leader has, changing specific departments, taking away specific rights, so that the leader doesn't have capabilities to leverage these things and make the system as simplistic and as accountable to them as possible. Thirdly, we tell you that leader has constant fear for himself to be told that he is working with the resistance, that he could be doing all these things. And this fear is irrational, that even if he works or doesn't work with the resistance, in all cases, the leader fears this, meaning that the leader is likely to do things like crack down on the resistance, do things like limiting the rights of his own population in order to look to the occupying force as if he's doing his job and doing the good things. Notice this incentive is disproportional, because you fear not only yourself but other factors, your family, your loved ones, your friends. It's likely to overrule all other incentives that may have them. Fourthly, we tell you, they're likely to leverage specific dirt that they have on you. Because of the period of time which you've been occupying leader and controlling this territory, you're likely to do some bad things, limit the rights of your own people, shoot at protesters, not allowing protests to happen, all of these things. And you have been the people who signed the document to do these things. Meaning that if, for example, you were to skew to the other side and help the resistance, or try to make the situation better, they can always tell you, but we have this dirt on you. No, you're not going to do these things, which is likely to leverage them. But 50, we tell, they're likely to make them, the occupying force, adapt their culture on you. So you wearing their clothes, following their traditions, doing the things to be looking as close to them and making relationship with them in order to do all these things. All of these are reasons why leader does not have capability on their side of the house, and most likely on both sides of the house side with the government, let's say. But they say benefit will happen. We disagree. Leader has no capability of doing this, these things. Meaning that consequentialism shouldn't be the debate, the metric on this debate. We think obligation should be. What existing mechanisms of obligation does leader have? Firstly, we tell you that leaders are explicitly placed in position of power in society. Either A, they have been democratically chosen by the people and people have given them sovereignty in order to be ruled by these people, or B, they're generously people who've earned the trust of the people there. So most likely they're entrepreneurs to some extent, people of wealthy families, people who've always been with the people who've done good things, etc. Meaning that the general population has given the special powers towards these people in order for them to control. Meaning that these people have a reciprocal obligation to the people to not allow problematic things to happen. But we tell you on their side of the house, they will necessarily do all these things for all the 5 constructive reasons we gave you in this speech. So they're likely to do immoral acts against their own population, limit their rights, force working camps for them, not allowing them to gather, etc. Likely to do, just keeping the machine going in and of itself is problematic. But second reason, we tell you that that leaders and people in general in this place have been raised by the current state and society that exists there. Like, for example, the infrastructure there, literally roads, hospitals, schools, they have benefited by this thing. But secondly, the people have most likely created structures, like, for example, jobs, like, for example, money flowing in, meaning that the people and the leaders have a reciprocal obligation towards these people to enact into their specific benefit and not allow an occupying force to do more problematic things on their side of the house and leverage information that they have in order to hurt them. But thirdly, we tell you that you have, and this is like the most obvious thing. Come on, guys. You have existing obligation to people who have been harmed by the war, people who have been killed, people whose wives and daughters, for example, have been raped or who have been victims towards the army, etc. You're basically betraying the trust on these people when you're siding with the enemy that wants and to limit and control and make the situation there worse on their side of the house. And you're making, you're by siding with them, you're helping them, you're making the situation more problematic. What is the comparative in this debate? As opening argument says, it's either to do nothing, which we're okay with, but it's also to help the regime. But why do we believe the second one is more likely to happen? Second one is more likely to happen is probably not regime, resistance. Resistance is likely to come up to you and ask for you to help them, supply them, give them money, or just be Ben general member. But here's the important comparative here. If you side with the resistance, we tell you this is irrespective of if it works, if you actually do manage to liberate the country or not, we tell you have an obligation to side with the resistance. Why is this true? Because these are the people who are likely to be leftovers of the previous state, who are likely to be members of the military, members of the population that are giving there, members of the people who the population has given them powers through the democratic principles, through generally state-owned principles. Irrespective if this works, you have an obligation to do this, or at least not to side with the enemy. And since we proved to you they're not likely to bring any benefits, closing government wins this round. Thank you.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech and am happy to call upon the member of opposition. Here.
Cool. Can everyone hear me? Is that you? Okay, yeah. Can I borrow your phone?
Yes.
Cool. So panel, we have been in the top room for a couple of rounds this competition, and the one thing we mainly learned is that specificity is the one that thinks you debate. I'm going to add the specificity in 3 levels. One, I'm going to tell you what keeping stability looks like on the both of the house, and why the metric shouldn't be keeping stability, but the humanity with which you do it, and why it's significantly better on our side. 2, I'm going to talk about why there's significantly more autonomy for the state on our side. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about it after the decision happens, why the situation is much better on our side. Only one point of rebuttal doesn't fit in. I want to quickly deal with CGL's principle. Notice that all the analysis about power mainly shows that you have an obligation to care for the people. That means that it can only win at the moment they show you that this has literally no consequences whatsoever, because at the moment it has, then the duty to care for the people and literally save life heavily outweighs that. The OG thinks the consequences are there, so that means he by definition beats one prop team, but I also think there's a massive tension there. I think the second big aspect is that they're massively inconsistent, because according to the logic, you should actively resist, whereas OG told us you're not going to actively resist, but mainly do nothing. So I do think there's a tension there. What I'm telling you, firstly, the rest of the rebuttal will be interwoven. 1, what keeping stability looks like. So first half basically explained that you know people and therefore you're going to keep stability better. Notice that the metric on stability, keeping stability, was how stable you are. That's a metric you frankly don't care about, because the moment you get oppressive enough, by definition you will get stability, but it looks horrible in terms of extrajudicial killings, fear politics, etc., etc. We are going to tell you why it happens in a much better way from a humanity perspective on our side. Notice that keeping order can exist on a spectrum. On the one hand, you have quite a cooperative idea where you talk with people, talk with protesters, try to be as humane as possible. On the other idea, you can be as oppressive as possible. And I'm going to give you a couple of reasons on why the oppressing state is going to be much more oppressive. Firstly, We acknowledge that you don't have the network of knowledge required to do it in a cooperative way. If you don't know the protest leaders, if you don't speak the language, if you don't know your culture, it's pretty much impossible to do it in a proper way. So that kind of regimes simply cannot do it. The second way is that they have no kind of accountability to prevent, for example, extrajudicial killings, etc. At the moment you're an occupant, the people can't vote in your country, simply your own population doesn't really care about it because it's outside of the media. It means you can literally do whatever you want. I want to make a comparative here, because OG tells you, well, you're only in place because the occupant wants you to be there. Yeah, but they forget the reason why the occupant wants you to be here. It's still because you have a basic support from the people and the people like you. China wanted Carrie Lam to step down. At the moment, she lost the support of the people, and the same we saw happening in other nations. And I think that's the crucial part here, the moment you lose out on that support. That's why you have to do a balancing act. Obviously, you need to listen to the oppressors, but you also are accountable to the people, because the moment they start hating you, there's no reason why the regime would let you catch you in place. That means you have significantly more accountability to do it in a proper way. I think the third one is the trade-off you make in terms of cost. We know that the occupant simply doesn't care about the people living in occupied nations, that they want to minimize all kinds of risk. That's why you see the horrific drone strikes, simply because they don't care about the lives of innocents, as long as there's a small chance that an American soldier isn't going to die. That's the kind of aspect you see. The trade-off is different for these leaders because they look like them, they speak their language, they know them, and have a basic kind of accountability towards them. It also means you're making a trade-off, you're taking a bigger risk towards your own people, do it in a more humane way. Why is it better on our side of the house? Well, because you have a basic kind of accountability, because you're there because the people still like you, but also because you know these people. They voted for you in the past. You're maybe part of the same ethnic group, so you feel a basic kind of obligation towards it. But you're also much better able than do it. The soft skills and the winning hearts and minds required to do it in a cooperative way is something we fundamentally do possess, they don't. Why should you care about this? The rest of the debate is rather wishy-washy and deals with many contexts in deadly different ways. I show you that we are literally saving lives, preventing extrajudicial killings, all the kind of issues. So I think that's an incredibly important aspect on that side of the house. I think second important part is that there are loads of room for enforcement. CD tells us there's nothing you can do, you simply need to listen to the instructions. We tell you that is false. It's not the case that the complete state apparatus is being changed on that side of the house. You are going to need local police officers, you are going to need local chief intendants. Note that in the individual execution level, you have a lot of discretion. You can decide on what to prioritize. You can even maybe not be too careful in terms of how you do the research. You can focus at many different things. There's all kinds of room on the our side of the house. Per my analysis, you're going to do it in a much better, much humane way, and discretion will be used better on the our side of the house. The third thing I do is I want to engage with OG, because I think it's far more likely that soldiers are going to get either fired or quit on the death of the house. You will be willing to fight for the general you know, and that general isn't going to fire you, but you're not waiting for the president of an occupying nation. It means all the harm subscribing, getting back to the farm, having no alternatives other than pick up a rifle, is having on the death side of the house because you don't want to fight for the occupant, but you might want to leave for a general. Here we like to the fact that many people on the ground actually take cues from people they see as authority figures. At the moment, the authority figures tell you, look, this is the best we can do, we need to portray stability, you're much more likely to do that. I'm going to take OG.
Considering that international scrutiny is highest at the point of occupation and 10 years later you only have domestic scrutiny, what incentives does the United States have in the long term to care about how Iraq is in 2025?
Yeah, like we agree that the US is horrible in Iraq, but they are still on the both sides of the house. We tell you that given the fact that you only have domestic scrutiny, the people still living in the nation in 10 years are presumably going to do better than the general who's there for 10 years as sort of a governor and then moves back to his own nation. Secondly, why are you going to keep significantly your autonomy on the outside of the house? O simply tells you at the moment you get unrest, people come in, we are going to mechanize it. I think the first crucial thing is that the thing occupying nation are most scared of is unrest. One, because they are afraid it might go to other countries. Look, for example, China and Hong Kong. But also because it puts their own soldiers, their own police officers, and their own expats directly at risk. That's the first thing where they care so much about. And going to do everything to repress unrest. I've already told you why that's harmful when they do it in a way. But I think the second crucial mechanism, and even more important, is that under their side of the house, people are going to accept a further infringement on the people. We don't think many people care that much about politics. They care more about their own life, their own stability, their ability to run a store, and having water run from the tap. At the moment, the streets are literally carnage. They are more than happy for someone to take in and restore order in any way possible. It means on that side of the house, occupants have the political capital to get more autonomy, whereas on the other side of the house, they don't. What's the comparative? I think the moment you occupy, you get trusted more and more. It means on the long time, you get more room to implement your own rules. That means you get more and more discretion to use in a good way. Given the fact that these people are comparatively better because they're at least basically accountable, that's a massive gain on the other side of the house. It means you have more autonomy and more distance. Thirdly, I want to talk about the post-transition issue. I think there are crucial changes here. One, I think the whole government apparatus is more likely to stay intact. You get people for consensual races simply moving out, low kind of level officer. You get people no longer being trained because the US doesn't have an incentive to do so. Politicians on our side of the house do. But I think the second important aspect of this is that you simply have the leader and that they have a basic kind of training and basic kind of skill. OG told us, yeah, but like the leader is going to get replaced. We think on the both of the house, you're going to have a new leader. The question is the apparatus under it. At the moment, it's the same people they have always worked for and using their authority to say it should come, then you're more likely to keep that apparatus in good check. That means post-transition, the situation looks much better because you have a functioning government and functioning authorities. I think OO did a stellar job of impacting that. At the end of the day, it's simple. These guys are more accountable. They care more about the people. We think that's incredibly important. Therefore, you're proud to oppose.
Goed man.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech and am happy to call upon the government whip. Hear, hear.
I am audible, I assume? Yeah, just 1 second then. This I don't need. Okay. Okay. Three, two, one, go. Okay, I would expect from someone who has been multiple times in a top room to understand how exactly obligation works and principled analysis compared in debates. We don't have to show you that there is no consequence on our side. We need to explain to you why on the comparative, this obligation is more important than the higher risk that you might take, for example, to help these people. This is what we need to prove to you in this debate. Debating is comparative sport. I think that we are pretty good at it. Second of all, I think that in terms of consequences, there are multiple times in which we as a society, even if something actually would have better consequences, we take obligation over it. We take morality over it. We don't collaborate with Nazis. We don't kill civilians in order to win wars quicker, even if it actually will kill less civilians. We don't enslave people in order to get the economy going and help even vulnerable groups. I don't think they have any responses to this, and I think it's kind of unfair in terms of just now taking it on in CO whip. Now look, their main argument: local institutions and local police are going to be owned by these people. Really no structural analysis here. Why, in terms of the methods of occupation, this is going to be the case. Look, Rumen already explains to you, and notice they had ability to engage with our analysis that engages with their own extension. Notice in this time, over time, you're likely to pick the own people. So even if you don't remove the leader, you're likely to start from certain places that you're able to. You're likely to, even if they pick local people, to pick people who are actually closer to your government, to even bribe them, to even blackmail them, etc., etc. Especially if you're a disproportionate power state and you're basically finding an, I don't know, an high administration guy in a small occupied country. I think you can do it, especially if you're Israel, for example. Secondly, I think that like you have still specific presence over there, like military. This is what happened in Iraq, etc., etc. And I think at the end of the day, you're still going to leverage for certain positions. You're not going to do it all the time if this is like their best case scenario, but you're going to do it in the times that matters. So for example, when they're deciding who to trade their oil with or resources, when they're deciding what their national identity should look like, if this national identity actually is detrimental to your narrative that you want to push as a government. It also changes a lot in terms of if the government changes, it has other incentives. You still believe on the probability that like even like coronavirus happens, there is a right-wing government. That right-wing government decides that they don't want to support you anymore, and they already have those privileges of power. I think that they basically say people are going to accept. Again, they had the chance to engage with already established analysis of Rumen in terms of why this is unlikely to happen, because Rumen tells you very clearly, these are previously occupied states. there's been war, there's been damage, there's been people raped, there's been people killed, there's been people who have created a narrative to fight. There has been a huge amount of resistance. Like the general example here is, if you now just let's say make Palestine a part of Israel, I don't think that people are going to be very okay with this. I think that even now, when Palestinian people don't really have a clear alternative, they're still against basically siding with the government of Israel. I think at this point, we basically, even if there's like accountability mechanisms on the comparative, best case scenario for them is these people are not going to harass them. They're not going to be that brutal, but are still going to take a large extent of their agency, especially when it matters the most. On the comparative, it's much more important to talk about this obligation. So I want to move on to opening government. I think that we have a couple of comparatives here. They basically prove you two things: a bit more security, and occupiers need help from leaders. So let's take on firstly the security. I think firstly, security can never live better. Like even if you work with the occupier state and now they give you a little bit food and now they give you a little bit of that and these resources, and it's kind of better because you can trade some. On the comparative, firstly, like there's a lot of things that can happen along the way and it doesn't really engage with our incentive mechanisms. But best case scenario, I think that in certain situations in which the government has no incentive to help you, in terms of like coronavirus hits, so they're far more focused on their own government, or for example, as I said, right-wing government comes into place. I think that when you compare this smaller chance for better security for the people, I'm not sure why these people would favor it more and why these leaders should favor it more, especially in terms of this basically mean that you're betraying every bit. Because look, I can be very well fed every day, but I still care about a lot of other things. I care about my identity. I care about having my own choice. I care about having my own representation. I don't think that they can win on this comparative, even if they're living pretty good lives, etc., etc. Now, occupiers need help from leaders, so they're likely to basically do all those things. I don't think that they prove an existing incentive for these leaders to basically occupiers help those leaders. But secondly, even if they have the incentive to help, you never give them the ability to make their own decisions. And I think that on the comparison, at some point the occupier will definitely choose their own country compared to the occupied ones. This is how basically international relations works. I'll take a PY from opening opposition. Anything?
So you concede that eventually these governments would leave. But more importantly, why can't the principal obligation be fulfilled by working with foreign administrations to save lives and reduce fighting, which are the preconditions to identity formation?
Great. Thank you very much. This is one of my biggest comparatives in the debate. At the end of the day, we also have to note that these leaders have a limited capacity to understand what exactly is going to be the consequence of their actions, especially in terms of they don't know the full story. They might be lied to. They might, for example, be promised things that they're not going to fulfill. They might be promised things from one leader who eventually changes to a much more right-wing leader. They might be blackmailed. They might be removed from power. They might be killed. I mean, Hamas has done that. I think that doesn't mean this was the wrong word I used, but yeah, basically, I think that governments kill leaders. That is my point, regardless of the example. So I think that on the comparative, it's more important to fulfill that existing obligations, and notice again, no engagement with why this obligation is very strong, which comes in Roman speech. On the comparative, I think that this is not an actor motion. So it's much more important to understand what you should do as an actor. And this is the main reason why opening government never really can prove to you a very large a change in status quo and helping a lot of people. It's far more important to talk about obligation. Very happy to propose, right? Thank you.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and to close out the back half and the debate as a whole, I'm happy to call upon the opposition whip. You're here.
Can you hear me? So I want to take a little step back because oddly enough, who was the first person to ask the question within this debate, namely, what happens if you don't assist? What is the political system that occupiers have an incentive to create? We tell you that the entire government's bench problem is that they never prove to you why not assisting and resisting is actually better. They give some reasons as to why assisting could be suboptimal. They never prove to you, while actively resisting gives you more autonomy, why it actually does develop political institutions, any of that. The second thing that he crucially adds, I think he's the first speaker in this debate that actually mechanizes how assisting would work, right? And why these incentives are there. He talks to you about enforcement, something that is actually incredibly important at the moment that you are a local politician in an occupied region. I think because we are specific, because we provide the context for OO's arguments to work, we are the team that eventually takes this debate. Before I move on to talk about A, the long-term transition, and B, stability during the occupation, I want to briefly deal with CG's principle. Note that CG's principle is relatively extreme, right? They say if there is nothing, absolutely nothing that you can mean to your people, the best thing that you can do is stay loyal to them. I honestly think that assisting with an occupier is too high impact to mean that you should not give a shit about, sorry, my mom who's watching, not give anything about what is actually happening. Know that you have a responsibility to help, right? Even if there's only a possibility that you can do something, even if it's one water line that you can make sure doesn't get closed off, even if it's one protest that you are able to make sure doesn't get cracked down upon. As a leader, you have responsibility to every single individual, how minor it may be. I think that that means that the principle means that we need to prove a very small benefit or a very small harm. I think we do that sufficiently. Let's move on to the idea of long-term transition, because I think this question builds up on a lot of useful context that I think the rest of this debate relatively neglected. The first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, what do occupiers need right after the occupation? Because that means that we can explain what the political system will look like and what it afterwards will develop into. Note that after an occupation, the first thing that an occupier needs is stability. They took a risk with their army. The army just had to fight, so they're low on morale. They had to use resources. But crucially, right after occupation, there is still a lot of unrest, as no one has actually psychologically coped with the situation of being occupied yet. That means that priority number one for an occupier is to get control, is to get stability. We then tell you that local leaders are the best leaders to work with to actually make sure for an occupier that you are more efficient. Then the question becomes, what is the realistic alternative? I think Roel explains to you this incredibly well. He tells you that the alternative often is that politicians from the occupier are put in the position of the local leader that's unwilling to cooperate because they need people that are actually ruling that occupied area, right? The problem then is that you remove all politics that was originally there. You don't have a government apparatus that people are used to. You don't have politicians from that region because they're not willing to work with local politicians because they don't trust them. That means that you're unable to build up the local political institutions to actually rule eventually, because it's not part of politics that's overtaken. No, it literally becomes a province of a country because there are no local leaders that can actually do this. I think that means that we win. OO tells you it's so great that we can show to the US that we can rule. We actually show that you cannot show to the US that you can rule independently if you are unable to rule yourself in any sort of way. Then let's move on to stability during occupation. And I think a very big question here is, right, how do these local leaders interact with the occupier? Note that CG just gives a bunch of reasons. I all really like them, that it's incredibly difficult to have a lot of power, right? I think that means that at best, they marginalize our case a lot. And I am willing to concede that they are not going to change the entire country, right? But we give incredibly specific mechanisms that are incredibly meaningful. It is namely about enforcement of specific protests. We give you reasons as to why it is far more likely that these local leaders are going to do it well. We talk about the knowledge about the region that you're able to communicate. We talk about the accountability that you still have, right? It is far easier to rule at the moment that you have local support, and you're also able to keep that because you have the incentives to do so. But lastly, people people are more likely to remain the stability at the moment that an authority figure within their political community tells them to do so. So yes, it won't be easy to have a lot of sway, but also note that the occupier has an incentive to give a relative amount of independence to these local leaders. Moreover, though, and note that the comparative becomes incredibly important here, we tell you that you're more likely to be trusted at the moment that you're in the political system. That is because there's a lower risk of resistance. Literally, the gov alternative is active resistance. That means that if anything, right, you only give the occupier an active incentive to not trust the people that are there, to never collaborate and to never be relentless, because the moment that you look away, they will resist against you. At the moment that you make sure as a leader that you don't do that and that you actually assist, we think it's far easier. OG, please.
Just like I said in DPM, it is the occupier's incentive for stability that creates the incentive to quash the political and economically, domestically, to quash the possibility of resistance. This takes you both out of O and CO and what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan.
No, so I think that the problem is, right, that A, we tell you that it's easier to have stability at the moment you cooperate with local leaders. So if anything, is that what they're going for? They should cooperate them. But secondly, right, I also just don't think that, forgot it. Never mind. Last thing, I think that OG tries to squirrel out of it by saying there's certain scrutiny, media scrutiny to be good, and therefore occupiers aren't going to be that bad. Know that literally sovereignty is one of the most important IR concepts. If you're already willing to invade a country, I don't think the added scrutiny of not being nice to the sovereignty that you just violated is going to tip the scales, right? You already have huge amounts of media scrutiny. That one thing doesn't make the difference. Even the US in Iraq, right? They were seemingly benevolent, but still hugely criticized for a bunch of things that happened, and even for the invasion itself. So I think in that sense, that scrutiny isn't going to tip the scales. What do we then tell you? We give you a certainty. We tell you that at the moment that you cooperate with leaders, you get less relentless enforcement. You keep people safe and you're better able to manage your soldiers. I think that all of the analysis about political institutions from OG is very dependent on context. If anything, we give a more certain reasons why that's going to be true. For all of these reasons, please vote CO.
I thank the speaker very, very much for their speech, and indeed everyone in this debate.